Chapter 4. On the Buffalo Trail. "Look out!" Kaya cried. Two Hawks spun onto his side, and the cougar landed on the sand beside him. Kaya ran splashing up the stream, shouting and flapping her deer hide at the cougar. It clawed and bit at Two Hawk's arms and shoulders. Kaya lunged forward and pounded her fist into the cougar's nose. With both hands she grabbed handfuls of sand and threw them into the cat's eyes. Blinking and snarling, the cougar released Two Hawks and began to back away. It was a thin young cat with a lot of scars. Showing its teeth, it turned tail and retreated into the woods. Two Hawks yanked off his deer hide. Kaya motioned for him to let her see the wounds on his arms. She washed away the blood and exposed the scratches, which were not deep. The deer hide he wore, and Kaya's quick action, had saved him from deeper slashes. Kaya knew how to stop the bleeding. Although it was almost last light now, she found the plant called Wapawapel, good medicine for his wounds. She silently offered a prayer of thanks as she made a poultice of leaves and packed it onto the cuts. Then she sat back on her heels and drew a deep breath. "We must look out for each other," she signed. "You and I are not enemies." "No, we are not enemies," Two Hawks signed. "We have to stay together," she added. "We have to help each other." He nodded, his eyes downcast. "You did a good thing for me. How do you say good in your language?" "Tots," she said at once. After a moment, Two Hawks repeated, "Tots. Tots, Kaya." When light came again, Kaya and Two Hawks made their way up the stream, looking for a good place to fish. Kaya's breath clouded at her lips. During the night, a skin of ice had formed along the shore. How much longer would snow hold off? Here the streams widened into a basin before tumbling farther down. This was a good place to catch trout, or mountain whitefish. Kaya untied a piece of fringe from her skirt to use as a sniggle. She lay on her belly by the pool and dangled the fringe in the water. Fish would think the sniggle was food and bite into it. If she was quick, she could flip the fish onto the bank. Two Hawks tugged a piece of fringe from the side of his leggings and lay down near her. He dangled the fringe in the water and waited. Almost at once, a fish bit the fringe. Expertly, he flipped a large trout onto the stones. Soon Kaya felt a tug at her sniggle. With a flick of her wrist, she flipped another trout out of the stream and onto the bank. Good. They had enough for a meal. "I'll build a fire," Two Hawks signed. Kaya watched him choose a sharp stick for a fire drill. He put the point of the drill into a hole in a dry branch. Then he rubbed the stick between his palms until tiny sparks fell onto the dried moss. Soon a little flame burned, which he carefully fanned into a fire. Kaya silently thanked the trout for giving themselves to her and the boy for food. Then she cleaned the fish and placed them on sticks by the fire to cook. When the fish were done, she and Two Hawks sat by the fire and ate them. She licked every bit of oil from her fingers. Never had anything tasted more delicious than this meal they'd made together. As Two Hawks made a fire bundle to save the coals of their fire, a fine cold rain began to fall. "Hurry," Kaya signed. They had to find the buffalo trail before it was hidden by ice and snow. As Kaya and Two Hawks made their way uphill, the cold rain turned into sleet. Kaya pulled her deer hide over her head, but the sleet made it hard to see. She thought they'd be following the stream that would lead to the buffalo trail, but nothing here looked familiar. After a time, the stream they followed was nothing more than a small creek racing down the mountainside. Bighorn sheep leaped across ledges above them. Slipping on icy stones, Kaya and Two Hawks struggled upward. At last they reached the top. Two Hawks gave her a hand, and she climbed up onto a trail that ran along the ridge. The trail split around fallen trees, a path made by people on foot. Hoof prints were everywhere along it, too. "It's the buffalo trail," she signed to Two Hawks. Her heart lifted. Then she felt a stab of loss again. If only Speaking Rain were with us, she thought. Up here the wind was bitterly cold. Kaya and Two Hawks put their heads down and started along the trail. Kaya saw horse droppings and the remains of fires, but the marks weren't fresh ones. With winter coming, travelers had already left the mountains for shelter in the warmer valleys. But Kaya knew enemies used this trail too. "Keep a lookout," she signed. How terrible if enemies should catch them now, with home country only a few sleeps away. Wet and shivering, the two of them worked together to build a small lean-to against a rocky outcropping far off the trail. Because there was no water up here on the ridge, they scooped handfuls of sleet to suck on. If I had a bow and arrow, I could get us food, Two Hawks signed. But there's hardly any game up this high, Kaya answered. We'd still have nothing to eat. Then she saw some pines were marked where people had stripped back the bark to get at the soft underlayer. The underlayer was food for both men and horses when they had nothing else to eat. Here is food, Kaya signed. She began stripping back the bark with her knife. As Kaya and the boy ate, wolves began to howl to each other across the ridges. Kaya and Two Hawks huddled together for warmth like puppies. At first light, ice crystals glittered on frozen branches that rattled in the wind. Kaya and Two Hawks lined their moccasins with moss to keep their toes from freezing. Their fingers were blue and their teeth chattered when they took to the trail again. But during the night the sleet had stopped. Even though she was cold, this old worn trail comforted Kaya. She felt the presence of the people who had passed this way before her. After walking a long time, they came to a large cairn, a pile of stones that marked a special place. People had built many cairns along the Buffalo Trail. The cairns marked sacred places where spirits were very strong. Two Hawks went on down the trail to scout their way, but Kaya stopped by the old cairn. As she stood there, she thought she heard the voices of spirits. Were they reminding her that her name meant she who arranges rocks? Were they telling her to build another cairn at this sacred place? She couldn't lift big stones, so she collected small ones and piled them up until she'd made a mound. She wanted to offer something of her own, too. She opened her bag and looked inside. There was the magpie feather she'd kept. Magpie, her nickname. She tucked the feather under the top stone of the mound. All day and all the next day they climbed higher and higher. Kaya and Two Hawks looked around as they walked, often glancing up at the birds and clouds for signs of the weather. Suddenly Two Hawks pointed to a large tree far off the trail. There, high in the tree, was a platform of branches. A bundle was tied onto the platform. Had hunters left food there for the return journey? Two Hawks climbed up the tree to see. He came down with a rawhide bag slung over his shoulder. The rawhide was from the top part of a tepee, darkened from smoke that made it waterproof. This is a Salish bundle, he signed. My people hunt on this side of the mountain. My people hid this food here. Eagerly they opened the bag. Inside were dried kamas cakes and pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, grease, and dried berries. They sat under the tree to eat the tasty, nourishing pemmican. This unexpected find would give them the strength to push on. They were hurrying up along the trail when Two Hawks signaled for Kaya to halt. Look, he signed. Do you know that country? Kaya looked where he pointed. In the far, far distance she could see what seemed to be a stretch of prairie. Was that the prairie where her people sometimes dug kamas bulbs? If it was, they were closer to home country than she thought. Soon we will be with my people, she signed. Come on, Two Hawks answered. Let's get a better look. Kaya's heart was light as they scrambled up off the trail to a place where they could see more clearly. From up here, the prairie looked like a brown blanket laid out over land. Two Hawks was even more eager than she to see it. He climbed a tall pine until he was almost to the top, leaned out, and shaded his eyes. With a sharp crack, the branch he stood on snapped under his weight. Crying out with surprise, he pitched backwards and fell. He crashed down through the branches. With a thud, he hit the rocky ground and tumbled down the hill on the far side. He cried out again, this time in pain. Kaya rushed down to him. Clutching his ankle, he lay on his side. She crouched and saw a lump on his ankle. When she touched it, he gasped. She handed him a stick to use as a cane. He seized the stick and tried to rise, but when he put weight on his injured leg, he collapsed in pain. He tried again, only to fall a second time. His face was wet with sweat from his struggle. My ankle is broken, he sighed. Kaya bit her lip. She knew she wasn't strong enough to carry Two Hawks more than a little way. Maybe he could crawl a little way, too? But if he couldn't, how would they get out of the mountains? She hugged herself. What should they do now? The cold wind whipped about them, and last light was coming soon. They needed a shelter and a fire. Kaya collected dry twigs and sticks and handed Two Hawks the fire bundle he'd made. Grimacing in pain, he unwrapped the coals in the fire bundle and set about building a fire. As he worked, she gathered branches and built a lean-to shelter. How she wished for many, many hides to make the shelter windtight. They had the Salish food, but Two Hawks was in too much pain to eat. His teeth chattered and his whole body shook. His eyes were wide with fright. How could Kaya help him? She lay down against his back and put her arms around him to keep him as warm as possible. Still he trembled violently, though he would not cry. Then Kaya thought of the lullaby that Speaking Rain had sung. Kaya put her lips close to the boy's ear. Hanohi, she sang very softly. Hanohi. When at last he did sleep, he groaned over and over. Somehow Kaya slept too. She opened her eyes to a white world. Snow was falling thickly. Glittering flakes filled the air and drove into the opening of the lean-to. Snow covered the ground and weighted down the branches of the trees. Two Hawks tried again to rise, only to collapse onto his side. Kaya knew she couldn't carry him on the steep and icy trail. She'd have to leave him here, hurry on, and try to reach her people. If he stayed in the lean-to with some food, perhaps he wouldn't freeze before she returned with help. She crawled out of the lean-to and looked up toward the ridge. Drifts and blowing snow were all she could see. By now, snow would have covered the buffalo trail as well. As she stood in the whirling white, she saw a woman standing under a pine tree on the slope. The woman was tall and strong, like the woman named Swan Circling. She wore an elk hide over her shoulders, and snow glistened in her braids. Light surrounded her, like the sun shining on ice. While Kaya watched, the woman turned and strode up toward the ridge, looking back over her shoulder from time to time. Kaya clutched her hide around herself and followed. Upward she climbed, wet snow falling onto her shoulders from pine branches when she brushed against them. Snow fell onto her head and into her eyes. She wiped her eyes, and when she looked again, the woman was gone. In her place, a wolf stood gazing at Kaya with yellow eyes. She saw the black tips of its raised ears and its thick yellow-gray coat. It watched her intently as she climbed up to the ridge. When Kaya reached the top, the wolf trotted slowly down the slope on the other side. It paused now and then and looked back at her, as if waiting for her to come along. Was the wolf a Waiakin? Kaya hurried after it, and then with a bound, the wolf leaped down into the trees and disappeared. "Wait for me," Kaya whispered. With the wolf gone, the wood seemed much lonelier. As she searched the hillside for the wolf, she saw something moving. She ducked out of sight behind a tree and peeked around through the veil of snow. Farther down the hillside she made out a horse and a rider wrapped in a buffalo hide. Enemy? Friend? The rider led a pack horse and rode a large bay stallion. Could it be Runner, her father's horse? Could Tota be here in the mountains? Kaya went slipping and skidding down the hill, snow flying up around her feet. "Tota!" she cried as she went. "Kaya!" he called back, and turned the horses uphill to meet her. Then he was leaning over, lifting her up, putting her onto his horse in front of him. He wrapped her in the warm buffalo robe he wore and held her close. "Daughter, you're alive," he said. "And Speaking Rain, is she alive too?" Kaya put her face against Tota's chest. It was like a dream to be in his strong arms again. "Speaking Rain's alive, but she's a slave of our enemy," she said. "I escaped with the Salish boy, but he broke his ankle. He's over that hill," she pointed. Tota took fur-lined moccasins from his pack and put them on Kaya's cold feet. He pulled out another buffalo robe, wrapped it around Kaya's shoulders, and set her behind him on Runner. Leading the pack horse, they started back over the ridge to get Two Hawks. Kaya clung tightly to Tota's back. "How did you find me?" she asked. "We searched and searched but found nothing," Tota said in his deep voice. "Then, 2 sleeps ago, a scout came to our hunting camp on the Lachta. He'd come down from the buffalo trail to the river because snow was coming. He told us he'd seen a new cairn at a sacred place along the trail. The cairn was made of small stones, one someone with small hands might choose. Hands like yours, daughter." The scout said a magpie feather was stuck into the little cairn. I thought of your nickname, Magpie. I left our hunting camp and came up here to search for you. But if you hadn't seen me and come running, I wouldn't have found you in the snow. Were you watching the trail?" I didn't know where the trail was, Kaya began, but then she stopped herself. She wouldn't speak of the spirit woman who led her away from the lean-to. She wouldn't speak of the wolf who had brought her in sight of the buffalo trail, and Tota either. If the wolf was a Waiakin, she would not tell anyone until the proper time came. So much had happened to Kaya. How could she tell all of it? Where would she start? Tota, the raiders traded away my horse, she said. She's a good horse, he said slowly. Perhaps you'll see her some day. And Two Hawks, can we help him get back to his people, she asked. We'll help the boy join his people when the snow melts and it's time to dig roots again, Tota assured her. Kaya pressed her face to Tota's back. She closed her eyes tightly and forced herself to say what she had to admit. It's my fault Speaking Rain's a slave, she whispered. I thought of my horse before I thought of Speaking Rain's safety. But I made a vow I'd bring her back to us. Somehow. Tota reached back and pulled the buffalo robe closer about Kaya. We'll do all we can to find Speaking Rain, but you must not blame yourself that you were taken captive, he said. You were taken far from home, and you've endured much. But, daughter, you are alive and well. Let us give thanks to Hunyawat that you're with us again.